All right, we're going to get started. Thank you for being here. My name's Ken Kinecki. I'm the Vice President of Western New York Trout Unlimited and a 43-year fly fisherman. I started when I was very young. Uh, Unlike many people who start fishing because their parents or grandparents or someone in their family, got them into it. I just started because my brother actually got injured when he was like 12. So we needed to not play sports with him for a summer. So we needed to find something else to do. We thought fishing would be the thing. I just got into it by going to the library, reading a bunch of books, and which was weird because by 15, I was like a really pretty good fly fisherman. I don't know how I got into that out of all the ways of fishing. Our presentation here today is going to be on soft hackle flies, talking a little bit about their history, and then we'll go through that pretty quickly. And then we'll talk about the local flies that we see on our trout streams and how we develop some patterns to go ahead and address that fishing. For thousands of years, there were flies that were used to try to catch fish, but it's just wrapping chicken feathers and stuff on hooks and mostly trying to imitate bait fish. Dame Juliana Bergers, who wrote the first trout fishing book back in 1496, she actually tied some flies that were meant to imitate the actual insect. The problem was back then the hooks were really big, so the flies she tied were almost double the size of the naturals. Many of those were attractor patterns, really gaudy color, fancy wings. They didn't really look much like the flies. The first soft hackle flies that we can find were developed in England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales during the 18th century. There's a picture. That's like what the fishing is like over in England. The fisherman is there. There's a guide. There's beats. It's a very organized, no waiting, and you have to fish to fish that are feeding. You don't have to anymore, but back in the day, that's what it was. It's like when you back in the day, you used to be dressed up to go play golf. Back in the day, you used to dress up to go fly fishing. Earliest soft hackle flies were tied on the heavy wire snell hook. That's what was available during the 18th century. Over time, they started to develop light wire hooks and using rooster hackles or water buoyant furs and feathers that would allow the patterns to float. And those would more closely imitate your mayflies and caddis flies. Over time, advancements in the gear you'd use, split bamboo rods, drawn gut leaders, and silk fly lines led to the advent of dry fly fishing for trout. Dry fly fishing became the primary method for anglers in the streams of Britain and United States, 1800 to 1900. And here's one of the big books, Pritt's books, and you can see the soft hackle flies were tied on snell hooks where the tippet or the leader was tied right onto the fly itself. Again, the earliest public book that talked about soft hackles was Pritt, 1885, called North Country Flies. The first time where they took specific flies and developed specific patterns for fishing them. And it also included those full color plates so that while there weren't tying instructions, other anglers look at the plates and then develop their own imitations. We have a lot of these books in our TU library, which is over at Orvis in Williamsville. If you get a chance, you can go in there and sign these books out. There's over 150 books in the library right now, a lot of great works. A bunch of the books that are there are out of print, so there's some pretty good stuff there. The early books had very little information on tying the flies, more talked about the presentation. The the big thing with the soft hackle flies, the two things that make them the most effective are their very thin, sparse bodies and the very lifelike resemblance of the soft hackle to drown wings or legs of the natural insects. A lot of the flies that you go and see in a fly shop, they look beautiful sitting in the fly shop, but they don't really look a lot like the flies that you're going to see out on the water. Soft hackle flies look much more like the actual flies that the trout are feeding on than what you see in the fly shops. Frederick Halford was the sort of the father of the dry fly fishing when it switched over from wet flies to dry flies. And then it became, if you weren't dry fly fishing, there are still in England places where they won't let you fish. A lot of that came over to America in the early 19th or 20th century. In America, dry fly fishing was considered the way to go. Alfred, again, it was like a dogma thing. You got to do this. You have to fish the flies upstream, drag free, and also just fish to visibly rising fish. The soft hackle flies became mostly abandoned, except for anglers that followed the revolutionary works of GEM skews. The dry fly became king, and the soft hackle flies, which had been used for hundreds of years, caught hundreds of fish, started to recede back into the history of trout fishing in Britain and the UK. They're skews. One of my kind of fly fishing heroes. I have a really great copy of one of his books from 1907, signed. They say there's about 3 or 4 of these in the whole world, and I have one of them. So, he was a lawyer. He didn't really sign books, but I got a book that was over from England. He developed the use of lightweight rods, reels, and lines, fishing soft hackles upstream to visibly rising fish. He was using them to imitate the underwater nymphal forms of the hatching mayflies. The soft hackles, which were relegated to the scrap heap of history, except for the fact that they were great. They worked all the time. When you fished them, they caught a lot of fish. So they still maintained a pretty strong local usage and support over in England and Ireland, Scotland. The American fly fishing community initially copied the English by going to only dry flies. However, the very heavy populations of caddis flies in America would provide the rebirth for the soft hackle flies, and we're going to get to that in a bit. This is Ernest Schwiebert, great American fly angler. He was the first person, 1955, wrote some books that said, hey, there's all these blue dun and iron blue dun and Hendrickson and all the different famous mayflies. And he realized for most trout, that makes up 10, at most 20% of what they feed on. Mostly what they're feeding on are Caddis flies. Again, he wrote 2 books that really brought that to life. Matching the Hatch in 1955 and Nymphs in 1972. Matching the Hatch was the first book that sort of identified the American major mayfly hatches and their imitations. But he was the first writer to realize that the Caddis flies were way more prolific in our streams than the mayflies. He credited the legendary Michigan fly angler, rod builder, and fly shop owner Paul Young with the use of the soft hackle flies to address the Caddis hatches. The flies were called partridge spiders, and hundreds of these flies were sold out of his shop in Michigan. There's Paul Young building a bamboo fly rod, very famous bamboo fly rod builder, and his fly shop there in Michigan was a famous gathering spot for Michigan anglers. That's Schwiebert's first book, 1955, Matching the Hatch. And again, that was the book that pointed out, while we're all excited about fishing to all these mayflies and the big hatches, 80% or so of what the trout eat are caddis flies, because the larvae, the pupa, and the adults are much more available on the evergreen than the mayflies. Anglers throughout Michigan use the term caddis fly to incorrectly identify the very large hexagenia mayflies and the nymphal forms, these what are called Michigan wigglers. They call that a caddis fly, and the naming of those large mayflies as caddis fly was an impediment to the highly effective soft hackle flies becoming more popular. The fish as imitations of the large caddis fly populations. The streams not only in Michigan, but Ohio and Pennsylvania, New York, throughout New England. There's Uncle Ernie with the beautiful fish. Nice bamboo rod, nice reel. He was a real forward-thinking person. His second book was called Nymphs, a huge work, including full-page color plates of the trout stream insect. He actually went out and was one of the first anglers to go ahead and collect actual flies, not only the larvae and the pupae, but the adults as well. Because of the unique way that the caddis flies emerge, the underwater larvae and pupa forms are readily available to the trout, and they don't have to show themselves. When they're rising for mayflies, you can see where they are. When they're getting the larvae and pupa, they could stay down on the bottom or stay under the surface of the water. And that's again why most of their feeding is done that way. And the caddis adults only spend a very small amount of time on the stream surface before they fly away to the stream side vegetation. And there's the book he wrote, Nymphs, in 1972. And you can see on these, the color plates, these are caddis, larvae, pupa, and a lot of those look exactly like what a soft hackle fly looks like when it's wet. And one of the people we're going to talk about here is Sil Nems. He had like a eureka moment. He was fishing these soft hackles for a bunch of years, and he didn't really understand why they were so effective. But in 72, when he saw the book, it struck him as like, wow, that's exactly what the soft hackles are like. They look so much like the actual trout food that they're feeding on. Again, this talks about the soft hackles and wet flies. For a long time in the earliest 20th century, trout fishermen would go out and they were just hoping that they'd catch a mayfly hatch or an emergence. But for a lot of the time you spent on the water, there was nothing actually emerging or hatching. So you needed to try to find some patterns that you could use, that you could use those flies when searching just the trouty looking runs and riffles when there's not a hatch going on. And the soft hackle flies are ideal for that. They provide an imitation of a food that's available to trout 24/7 for a lot of the year, and much more available by numbers than the mayflies. There's Sil Nems on the fishing on the Bitterroot. He big fan of bamboo rods, silk fly lines, and nice reels. He published Soft Hackle Fly in 1975, a very small book. I added it to my collection back then. Again, at that point, I was 15 years old, but I'd gotten bitten when I was 13 by the bug, and by 15, I was into it, so I was buying fly fishing books. It opened my eyes to these simple flies that could be fished in a unique way to imitate the very prolific and widely available Caddis flies. Within a year, while I continued to carry mayfly nymphs and adults and spinners, I was using the soft hackle flies 90% or more of the time when I was out fishing. Again, the story about Sil was like, he couldn't really figure out why the flies were so effective until he saw those full color plates in the book Nymphs. And it was like, eureka, that's what it is. Those soft hackles look exactly like these Caddis pupa. So you could just change the color of that and imitate a huge amount of the trout food in any trout stream. That was that book. Again, very small. I read through it so many times. I wore out my first copy. I lost a bunch of pages. And I've since now added a signed hard copy. I fish with 6 of these soft hackles now for the last 30 years. And I never really felt like I was out there and didn't have something that I could use. And this was fishing across the West, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont. During the 70s and 80s, there were also other American fly anglers that came to understand the importance of the Caddis flies. Authors like Leonard Wright, Eric Leiser. Eric was a big friend of my father, and he actually fished the Genesee River with my dad back in the day. Larry Solomon and Gary LaFontaine all contributed important books to the study of the Caddis as trout stream food and fishing. The NEMS book had 14 patterns. Over time, I reduced it to 6, and I've used the 6 flies for more than 20 years now, and I can generally find something that'll work in streams across the country. Here's a listing of those 6 flies. Some of them are flies that you'll recognize some of these names. They're just tied in the soft hackle pattern. The pheasant tail, which is probably the most popular fly of all time in nymphs, but the soft hackle pheasant tail is just a fabulous pattern. The gold ribbed hare's ear, which is also a well-known nymph, is equally as effective as a soft hackle. Floss and hackle flies, where you can change the floss color of the body and just use any type of soft hen, rooster, or game bird hackle. Limitless number of options there, depending on what you're going for in size, in color, in barring, in the shape and softness. So it's a limitless number of floss colors and a limitless number of different feathers. So you can develop anything that you want for the streams that you're fishing and the flies that you see. Peacock curl and hen. I think everyone knows peacock curl on a fly has been effective for many, many years. The iron blue dun, a pattern that, while it's listed as a dun, imitates the black Caddis and any dun tinted mayflies and dark midges. And a fly that I love, it has a great name, but it's a killer fly called the Tups Indispensable. And it's a light colored fly. So if the flies that you're fishing to are light cream colored, for a sulfur hatch, Tups Indispensable is an awesome fly. And in sizes 12, 14, and 16, you could spend years fishing with this short list and be very successful. That's one of the things I like about it. I don't have to carry, 15 boxes of every fly in the world. I carry 3 or 4 boxes some spinners, some nymphs, but I have 2 boxes of soft hackle flies, and basically that's what I'm using all the time. Nemsen published a second book called The Attic, and it focused a lot on the history, also chapters that deal with how you fish the flies, and we're going to talk about that in a sec. He also introduced 6 new flies and hinted at the use of using the soft hackle fly to then imitate various mayflies. Once he got and like myself, so used to fishing these, it was like, well, gee, when we're out there and there's a Hendrickson hatch or a blue-winged olive hatch, why don't we just develop a soft hackle pattern that'll work to imitate those? And over time, that's what we've done. And then his last book in 1991, Soft Hackle Fly Imitations, he did develop a bunch of patterns for specific hatches for Tricos and Hendricksons and sulfurs and brown drakes and other mayflies, where you could just use the soft hackle pattern to develop any type of fly that you want for the types of flies and the fishing that you'd see in your area. I've developed 3 patterns that imitate mayflies that we normally see here in Western New York, 2 patterns specific for Western New York Caddis emergences, and a pattern used to imitate mayfly spinners. A lot of guys don't like fishing spinner falls for mayflies because it's dark, it's hard to see, small flies are flush floating. We'll talk about the pattern I developed, and I'm a huge fan of fishing spinner falls. They're still out there fishing. Here's the cover of Soft Hackle Fly Imitations. Here's a couple of the flies that we've developed locally. The Hendrickson talks about how you tie that. And you'll see in all these discussions of these flies, it's not really rigid about, well, it's got to be this color of dubbing or this kind of body. It's left up to you. Whatever you see out there, whatever the fish are feeding on, that's the type of fly you want to tie. And you're just using the soft hackle as a sort of the base recipe. You can change the hackling, the ribbing, thread, all that to best imitate the flies that you're seeing. You can also take the Hendrickson pattern and tie it in a lot smaller size, down to a 20, to fish for the blue-wing olives or the Paralepta flevias, the mahogany dun hatches, which are, that's the mahogany dun is probably the biggest hatch that we see out in Western New York. It happens pretty early in the year, though, and a lot of people totally miss it. Or when they see it, they think, oh, those are Hendrickson, but they're really not. They're a much smaller fly, in about an 18 to 20, but it's a really big hatch. We developed a fly for the sulfurs. Sulfurs are a pretty popular fly all across Western New York. A lot of the streams have sulfurs, the various types of sulfurs. And again, it's not a specific, this is how you have to tie the fly. You got to use this color fur and this type of body. There's a lot of variability there. Tie the type of fly that is best going to imitate the flies you're going to see for the fishing that you're going to do. And then there's a Cahill fly that we've developed. Since there's a lot of Cahill activity on our streams, the biggest issue with the Cahills around here, you rarely see a really big hatch or emergence of them. They sort of hatch all day long sporadically, but those nymphs of the Cahill are underwater all the time. So using a Cahill soft hackle is just a great pattern to use July of the year when those flies are coming off. There's the Hendrickson soft hackle, and that's what it looks like. Little wood duck where you can use poly tails, multicolored dubbing. You're gonna have to look at the flies where you fish. Some of the Hendricksons are much more rusty or brown. Some of them are more olive. And then a partridge hackle at the head. The sulfur, dirty sulfur body, fur or poly dubbing, wood duck, poly tail, or that one has a very soft hen tails on it. And a light cream hen hackle, ginger and cream cock hackle for webbing up at the front. Again, the sulfurs will vary in Western New York from a very bright sulfur to a kind of a dirty sulfur to some flies that have a lot more olive in them. So you'll want to tie them for the flies that you see on the streams that you fish. There's a pretty nice brown trout caught at Awaka Creek at Garbett on a sulfur soft hackle, fished upstream as an emerging nymph, which is one of the great things about using soft hackles. A lot of them, people think they're wet flies, and you throw them out there and you drag them through the riffles. I actually find that it's better to cast up and across, and the soft hackle will just lie right underneath the surface of the water, looking like an emerging nymph. You can see it's a very successful fly. There's the Cahill soft hackle, cream and gold body, thorax of tan or gold fur, a few strands of grizzly hen hackle for the tail, and a very light partridge hackle, tied in pretty sparse. Again, the one thing about soft hackles, they do not look beautiful like the the dry flies that you'll see at the Orvis shop that are, they look beautiful. They don't look much like what the real fly looks like. Soft hackles much more closely imitate what the actual flies look like. And this is a killer pattern in July. The Cahills are hatching sporadically all day long. You can just fish this through riffles on the Wiskoi, and awesome pattern. There we go. That's a nice Wiskoi Creek trout caught on a Cahill soft hackle. Developed two flies specifically for the caddis fly hatches that we'd see in our area. The black caddis, or what some people call it the Mother's Day caddis, because that's kind of around the time of the year when those come out. And again, those can be tied a lot of different ways. This particular fly, the hackle is actually gathered and tied down along the top of the fly body. So it looks much more like the picture of the flies that we saw on those plates in the book Nymphs. All the hackles are tied together. The hackle can be longer than normal with these fibers going back past the bend of the hook. And again, that's based on those plates. You can see the legs of those Caddis flies actually extend in many cases past the body. The other fly we developed for Western New York hatch is called the apple caddis. Now you'll see this along other streams, but for me, even back into the 80s and 90s, this was a puzzling hatch that you would see out on the Wiskoi. You'd be fishing 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden it was just like all these white flies were in the air everywhere. And it would only last 15 or 20 minutes. We could never figure out what was going on. And a couple trips there, we actually said, we're not going to fish. We're going to get in the water and see what happens. Got our nets out, my father and myself, and we actually figured out what was happening. This real specific apple caddis, very bright green body, and a white wing. So when it was flying, that's why we called it the popcorn hatch. It looked like kernels of popcorn, like in the air. Um, the fly we developed then solved the riddle of the really, it's very short lived. It's like 15 or 20 minutes, but it's like a blizzard. There's times when you're on the whisk point and it's just thousands of flies just materialize all at once. We've also seen the fly on the East Quay, the Genesee, and the Delaware River system. I thought the flies I had seen on the whisk Quay were like in the thousands. I've been on the Delaware for the apple caddis hatch, million, literally enough to where you're just like, they're all over you. They don't, most caddis flies are blind. They're landing all over, but clouds of them, unbelievable amounts of hatching. And what you need to know is what time of year that's going to happen. It's usually the end of May into June. And you go and you fish the apple caddis soft hackle, and you have to start fishing it just based on the time of the day, because the hatch happens so fast. If you try to like wait for the flies to be in the air, you've missed the most part of the emergence. So that's what the black caddis, the Mother's Day caddis, looks like in a soft hackle fly pattern. But black mole fur or fine black polydubbing, partridge or grouse, and again tied where you like gather all the hackle up, put it on the top of the fly. And there's the apple caddis, again a really bright green body and a light cream hackle, or that's a partridge hackle on that one. And again, this pattern solved the riddle of these hatches that we used to see on the West Quay and the East Quay. But you got to know, you just got to get there and start fishing with them, and just all of a sudden, there's so many of these flies in the water. The fish are feeding to them, and then you'll notice the adults are in the air. Looks like popcorn. The last fly we developed was a rusty spinner. Um, a number 14 rusty spinner. You can use it all of April, May, June, and July out here at night. Any spinner fall that will generally catch fish. You are using light wire hooks and pretty fine tippet. And while many anglers dislike fishing spinner falls because it's hard to see your fly, these flies, being a soft hackle, can be fished on a slightly down and across cast, and you get really aggressive takes, so it's pretty easy to hook up. Mostly the fish are hooking themselves. Unlike when you're fishing a regular spinner fly, you're fishing upstream and it's in the dark and you can't hardly see the fly because it's flush floating, and the fish are just coming up and sipping them. You miss a lot of fish. Using the rusty spinner soft hackle, you rarely miss any fish. The take is so good, and you're fishing slightly down and across, so the hookups are pretty easy. And that's what the rusty spinner will look like. Over time, over more years that I use this fly, the most important part of tying these and fishing them is having the minimal amount of wing material. A regular spinner, a natural, has the wings are just so translucent and flush floating on the water. There's really nothing there. So when you have a fly like this, which is a fly that you would see in a tackle shop, to the fish, what that looks like is like a cross floating downstream, because that wing is backlit by the setting sun, and that the wing just looks like a cross floating in the water. the least amount of material you can use on the wing, the fly becomes more effective. Down to some of them, I'll actually only have like 3 or 4 strands of the poly wing material. And it's like, well, it's harder to see. It doesn't matter. You just cast it down and across, and the takes are so good. The fish are generally hooking themselves. Um, Another big secret to using spinners, and I don't know why, I've known this to be true for many years. If you tie a little bit of yellow poly at the back where the tails are to make it look like an egg sac, the fish love those more than the regular spinners. I don't know why. It's hard to believe that the fish actually can either see that or taste it, but when you use that, um, the flies are even more effective. And this proves it. Rusty spinner, and see that little bit of yellow? That's a little egg sac tied at the back of that. And that's about a 18 or 19-inch fish on the Wiskoi. And again, it wasn't, you could see it wasn't that dark. It was just getting towards dusk when I took that fish. And yeah, boy, I love fishing spinner ponds. You get some of the really big fish like that actually feed, because the flies are not going anywhere. They mate, fall in the water, they're done. That life is over. They're just floating, and the fish can just sit there and sip them all. The recent advent of bead heads or lead eyes and different weights that you can add to nymphal fly patterns um, been a good thing. And I have adopted the use of small metal or plastic bead heads or very fine wire tied along the fly bodies, uh, fine wire ribbing to provide a small amount of weight to the soft hackles. When you're drifting the soft hackles and fishing them, they're mostly within a couple inches of the surface of the water. They're just slightly underwater. There's a lot of times though where the fish are feeding a little bit deeper. So adding a little bead head or a small amount of weight allows that fly to get down 12, 18, even 24 inches if you can actually cast upstream, mend, and let that fly get down in the water column to where the fish are. A lot of times, especially fishing down deeper, use a small poly foam strike indicator because the fly is then farther down in the water column. You can't really see the take. A regular soft hackle fly with the fly in that 0 to 6 inch area right along the surface of the water, you can see the take. There's not like a regular rise form, but there's a bulge or the fish will come up and you'll kind of see the take. When it's deeper, you'll want to use a little strike indicator. Um, I also have used lightly weighted soft hackles and now some heavily weighted ones tied on larger salmon hooks. And those flies are really effective on our local steelhead stream. I was just talking to someone at the booth here about last Monday. I fished at 18 Mile Creek. Um, the water was low and clear. I walked quite a ways, but I found the pot of fish. I had a black stonefly at the end of my line, tied on about 18 inches of tippet, put a number 12 pheasant tail soft hackle, and I hooked the fish and lost it, hooked the fish and landed it. So we're talking, these are like 5, 6 pound steelhead on a number 12 fly. So very effective flies. That the lead fly there acts as a little bit of weight, get that down, and then that trailing fly is in the area of the water column where the fish are. And I talk a little just using a big weighted nymph in front. would tip it off the bend of that hook, put a nice meaty soft hackle on there as a point fly, and that's my go-to for fishing for steelhead locally. This is the West Branch of the Delaware. Last year I was out on the West Branch of the Delaware. That's a deer that was crossing the water in front of me. The water is about that deep, 3 or 4 feet, 3 or 4 feet deep there, 3 feet deep. And that deer just like walked across it like it was nothing. If I was out there waiting, I would have been like, whoa. So it was pretty amazing. One of the great parts about fly fishing, aside from like all the cool equipment and being outdoors, is you get to see stuff like this. I caught one fish that night, but this picture was worth more than that day's worth of fishing. Just to see that deer come over there and cross the stream. That's the presentation. The biggest thing I could tell you about soft hackles, one, they're easy to tie. Two, they're easy to fish. And three, what makes them so effective is that they look so much more like the actual flies that the trout are feeding on. Still you see in the catalogs and in the fly shops, all these flies, and they look so beautiful, and it's like, look at that hackle. But if you look at that next to the actual fly that the fish are feeding on, many of those flies don't really look like what the fish are eating. But a soft hackle fly, which like this fly here, if you go back and look at the plate on nymphs, that's exactly what you're seeing out there. And again, the legs tend to be as long as the body, sometimes a little bit longer. But once that soft hackle is wet, that's exactly what it looks like. And I believe that's why there's such a great pattern and can be tied in different sizes, different body colors, there's a limitless possibility for what you can do with these flies. Any questions? Any comments? Do we have any Trout Unlimited people here? Yes. For the people that aren't, we strongly recommend that you become a member of Trout Unlimited. Not only is the group interested in conservation, we also talk about fly tying and fishing, and we have some programs to help youth and veterans, and it's a lot of what we do is extremely worthwhile, and it's a lot of fun. I do a lot of work fly tying with the veterans up at the Buffalo VA, and the program got mothballed during COVID, but we resurrected it. I remember I got up there and I was all worried about how's this going to work, and boy, am I going to do this? Are these guys going to think I don't know what I'm talking about or that? And it's just been like the most amount of fun. It's just, you get up there, they're so happy to see you. A lot of the fun is these guys they've never tied a fly before in their life, so we're starting from scratch. And it's fun just watching them like struggle in a way, or they make fun of each other, like, what the hell are you doing? Listen to the guy, he's trying to tell you how to do this right now. And we just have like a great time up there. There's going to be fly tying up at the Buffalo VA on the 28th of this month at 6:30. I'd invite everyone to come on up and spend some time with vets, and there's people usually from Trout Unlimited there to help us, and we just have a really good time. Incredibly enough, the flies that we're tying for this month are soft hackle flies. We've been tying dry flies and Adams and streamers, and we tied some steelhead flies and some egg flies and different stuff, woolly boogers and things like that. But this month we're actually going to tie some soft hackle flies, which should be good for them because they're so easy to tie. There's not a lot of stuff to do. These flies that have 8 different pieces and parts and that, yeah, some of that's been pretty hard for the people. So I invite everyone to come up Buffalo VA on the 28th, 6:30 at night. Give us a hand, and again, recommend that. Join Trout Unlimited, great organization doing great work in the local area. Thanks so much. Appreciate you showing up.